Welcome to Ecopedia, where ideas meet identity. Today's question is simple but powerful. Is being selfish truly wrong? Imagine a conversation not between people but between your heart and your logic. One speaks with emotion, the other with reason. Who will you side with? Let's dive into the dialogue and discover what lies between self-care and selfishness.
Is being selfish wrong? A dialogue between heart and logic. The question of whether being selfish is inherently wrong has long provoked debate across philosophy, psychology, and ethics. This article explores the moral and psychological complexity of selfishness through a unique lens, a dialogical exchange between two symbolic voices, heart and logic. By juxtaposing emotional insight with rational analysis, the article uncovers how selfishness can be both a necessary act of self-preservation and a potential source of relational and societal harm. Rather than aiming for a binary answer, this dialogue seeks to deepen our understanding of when, why, and how selfishness emerges, and whether it can be morally justified in a world that constantly negotiates between self and other. 1. Introduction. The inner debate we all know. At the center of nearly every moral decision we face lies an internal dialogue, a tug-of-war between our desire to protect ourselves and our impulse to care for others. This is the inner debate we all know, though it often takes different forms depending on the context. Should I stay late to help a colleague or go home to rest? Do I speak my truth, knowing it might hurt someone, or do I remain silent to keep the peace? These questions don't always have clear answers, because they involve values that are equally important: self-respect and compassion, autonomy and connection, truth and tact. This inner conflict is not just a modern psychological phenomenon, it's a fundamental aspect of human nature. Ancient literature, religious teachings, and philosophical writings across cultures have wrestled with this tension. In Buddhism, the path of compassion must be balanced with detachment. In Christian doctrine, self-sacrifice is celebrated, but not without caution against pride or burnout. Even Greek philosophy recognized the importance of eudaimonia, human flourishing, which includes personal well-being as a moral good. What makes the debate even more complex today is the clashing messages from society. On one hand, we're encouraged to practice self-care, prioritize mental health, and put ourselves first. On the other hand, we are told to be kind, serve our communities, and suppress selfish urges. Social media glorifies both the hustle culture and the soft life, both the lone wolf mindset and the ride-or-die loyalty to others. It's no wonder that people often feel conflicted and guilty no matter what choice they make. This inner debate is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of moral depth. It means we're trying to reconcile two legitimate human needs: the need to belong, to be loved, to contribute; the need to be free, to pursue our own values, to protect our time and energy. The struggle between selfishness and selflessness is not always about right versus wrong. Often, it's about finding harmony between two equally essential parts of ourselves. In this article, we externalize that conflict through the symbolic characters of heart and logic, two inner voices that speak for different parts of our moral identity. This imaginative dialogue doesn't offer black and white answers, but rather illuminates the gray areas where real-life decisions unfold. As we follow the conversation between heart and logic, we are invited to reflect on our own decision-making patterns. Do we overextend ourselves out of guilt? Do we retreat into selfishness out of fear? Can we trust ourselves to know the difference? This exploration begins where every ethical journey starts within the quiet, often contradictory conversation we have with ourselves. 2. The dialogue begins: selfishness in conversation. To explore the complexity of selfishness, we turn to a metaphorical conversation between two inner voices that exist within all of us: heart and logic. These voices don't represent good and evil, or right and wrong. Rather, they embody two contrasting yet complementary forms of moral reasoning. Heart speaks for emotion, empathy, relational values, and our human longing for belonging. Logic, meanwhile, speaks for reason, autonomy, strategy, and self-preservation. Each voice brings valuable insight, and each one is limited without the other. Let's imagine a moment. A person is offered a promotion that would double their income but require moving across the country away from their aging parents, close friends, and familiar community. It's a dream job, but also a potential source of guilt and emotional strain. In that moment, heart and logic begin their conversation. Heart, concerned and tender. I feel uneasy. If I take this path, who am I leaving behind? Will my parents feel abandoned? Will I become just another person who puts success before relationships? Logic, clear and analytical. This opportunity might not come again. You've worked hard for this. If you decline, you may regret it. Your personal growth matters too. And with technology, you can still stay connected to family and friends. This dialogue represents the type of internal deliberation we go through all the time. On the surface, it looks like a disagreement, but beneath it lies a shared desire to do what is right for oneself and for others. More broadly, this conversation shows the moral complexity of selfish decisions. Is choosing your well-being selfish if others are disappointed by your choice? Is saying no to someone else's needs an act of coldness or courage? Is self-preservation a betrayal of love and duty? Both heart and logic respond to these questions with different instincts. Heart is oriented toward emotional bonds, social harmony, and nurturing. A logic is focused on rational outcomes, long-term benefit, and internal integrity. The conflict between the two arises not because one is right and the other wrong, but because they value different kinds of truths. For example, heart values emotional truth. What will this choice feel like for others? A logic values practical truth. What will this choice lead to in real terms? This is where the concept of ethical tension becomes important. Moral dilemmas often arise not from a conflict between good and evil, but between two goods. In this case, loyalty versus ambition, connection versus growth, short-term peace versus long-term benefit. By personifying these voices, we allow readers to witness the inner workings of moral reasoning. This dialogue helps us see that selfishness is not a simple, selfish thought. It is often a deeply considered, emotionally charged, and rationally justified decision. It's a judgment call made in the intersection of feeling and thinking. The rest of the article will continue this exploration, showing how heart and logic navigate key arguments from empathy and guilt to boundaries and autonomy to the possibility of moral selfishness. But this opening exchange reminds us of an essential truth. The battle over selfishness is not external, it begins inside us, every time we face a decision where someone loses and someone gains. 3. The emotional argument: empathy, guilt, and belonging. When confronting selfishness, heart speaks first, not just with feeling, but with a deep sense of emotional responsibility. To heart, selfishness is troubling not because it breaks a rule, but because it hurts. It wounds relationships, shakes trust, and can fracture a sense of belonging that people spend years building. At its core, the emotional argument rests on 3 psychological pillars: empathy, guilt, and the deep human need for social connection. Empathy, the bridge between selves. Empathy is what allows us to imagine the emotional experience of others. Neuroscientific research shows that when we observe someone in pain, whether physical or emotional, our brain activates in ways similar to experiencing the pain ourselves. This neurological mirroring is foundational for human cooperation and compassion. From heart's perspective, selfishness is dangerous because it short-circuits empathy. When someone consistently prioritizes their own interests while ignoring the needs or struggles of others, they sever the invisible thread that binds us together. That thread is built not on logic, but on emotional resonance, the feeling of being seen, heard, and considered. Without empathy, relationships become transactions. People become tools. And over time, that dehumanization leads to loneliness, not just for those around the selfish person, but for the selfish person themselves. Guilt, the moral pain of the conscientious. Heart also brings up guilt, which acts like an internal alarm bell. Unlike shame, which says, "I am bad," guilt says, "I did something that hurt someone else." In small doses, guilt is healthy. It alerts us to our impact on others, even when our intentions were good. But in the context of selfishness, guilt becomes a battleground. People often feel guilty for doing what's best for themselves, even when it's necessary or justified. This is especially true in cultures or families where self-sacrifice is glorified and individual needs are downplayed.
For example,
A woman saying no to her family's expectations may feel crushing guilt, even if she's protecting her mental health. A friend who decides to stop being the emotional caretaker in a one-sided friendship may wrestle with guilt, despite setting a fair boundary. From Hart's viewpoint, guilt is both a compass and a burden. It urges us to remain morally connected to others, but it can also trap us in cycles of self-denial if we don't balance it with self-compassion. Belonging, our deepest emotional need. Perhaps the most powerful emotional argument against selfishness comes from our need to belong. Psychologist Abraham Maslow included belonging as a core human need, essential for psychological health, just like food or safety. We seek connection not just for survival, but for meaning. Hart argues that chronic selfishness, the kind that prioritizes personal gain over shared well-being, threatens the social glue that makes belonging possible. When someone consistently acts without regard for others, they erode the trust that community, friendship, and love require. Selfishness sends a message: my needs matter more than yours. And while that message might be necessary in some cases, as logic later argues, Hart reminds us that it often feels like rejection to the people around us. Empathy is the invitation to relationship. Selfishness, when poorly timed or poorly delivered, is the withdrawal of that invitation. But emotional arguments aren't always right. Hart also struggles with an important realization: emotions can be misleading. Sometimes we feel guilty not because we've done wrong, but because we've disrupted a toxic pattern. Sometimes empathy becomes over-empathy, leading to burnout and emotional exhaustion. And sometimes the need to belong leads people to suppress their truth just to keep others happy. These insights set the stage for logic's rebuttal, a reminder that while emotional reasoning is vital, it must be complemented by clarity, autonomy, and rational boundaries. In summary, Hart doesn't reject all forms of self-interest. It simply urges emotional integrity. Its central question is not, did you help others? But rather, did you consider others in your choice? That consideration, even if the final decision leans towards self-preservation, is what transforms a selfish act from careless harm into conscious responsibility. 4. The rational argument: individual rights, boundaries, and autonomy. If Hart argues that selfishness must be handled with empathy and care, logic responds with clarity, structure, and a powerful reminder: you are a person too, and your needs, values, and time are not inherently less important than those of others. The rational argument for selfishness doesn't promote coldness or cruelty. Instead, it insists on balance, drawing upon core concepts of individual rights, healthy boundaries, and personal autonomy. These ideas are often seen as harsh or self-centered in emotional contexts, but logic views them as essential to long-term well-being, fairness, and sustainable relationships. Individual rights. You are not a resource. Every person has the right to act in their own best interest, provided they are not actively harming others. This principle is foundational in ethics, law, and personal freedom. The right to say no, to leave a situation, to pursue one's goals. These are not luxuries. They are entitlements rooted in the belief that no one exists solely to serve others. From logic's view, labeling all acts of self-prioritization as selfish is both inaccurate and dangerous. It perpetuates martyrdom culture, where people, especially caregivers, women, or those in service roles, are expected to constantly give without rest, without limit, and often without appreciation. But true morality doesn't require self-erasure. Logic reminds us: you are not obligated to light yourself on fire to keep others warm. Just because someone wants something from you does not mean they are entitled to it. Having needs does not make you weak. Protecting your time, energy, or dreams does not make you a bad person. It makes you a person, period. Boundaries, the architecture of respect. Boundaries are often misunderstood. They're not walls to shut people out, but guidelines that protect connection by defining what is and isn't acceptable. Without them, relationships become chaotic, uneven, or emotionally unsafe. Logic argues that selfishness becomes necessary when boundaries are consistently crossed, whether by manipulative family dynamics, overly demanding coworkers, or romantic partners who expect sacrifice without reciprocation. Consider these examples. A friend always asks for favors, but never shows up when you're in need. A workplace expects overtime without compensation or gratitude. A partner dismisses your feelings in favor of their own convenience. In such cases, asserting your needs may be labeled as selfish, but it's actually an act of emotional maturity. Setting boundaries is a form of self-respect that, paradoxically, allows for healthier, more honest relationships. Boundaries are also proactive. They teach others how to treat you. By communicating your limits clearly, you don't just protect yourself, you also offer others a map for respectful engagement. Autonomy. The right to be the author of your life. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of logic's defense of selfishness is the principle of personal autonomy. You have one life. You are responsible for how it unfolds. And no one, not your parents, your partner, your boss, or even society, should dictate the path you take. Autonomy is the freedom to make choices based on your own values, not out of guilt, fear, or social pressure. It means being able to say no without over-explaining. Leave situations that drain or diminish you. Invest in your passions and future, even if others don't understand. Logic emphasizes that autonomy is not the rejection of others, but the integration of self into the decision-making process. If we never consider our own well-being, we are not being moral, we are being controlled. Moreover, long-term altruism cannot be sustained without autonomy. Burned out, overextended people cannot offer compassion freely. Healthy selfishness, the kind that preserves your physical, emotional, and mental resources, allows you to give from abundance, not obligation. But rational arguments aren't always gentle. Logic, while clear and consistent, is also aware of its limits. Rationality can lack empathy. It may justify emotionally painful decisions with cold precision. It may overlook nuances such as cultural expectations, trauma history, or emotional vulnerability in its pursuit of what seems objectively fair. In this way, logic must be tempered by heart, just as heart must be anchored by logic. Together, they form the full moral compass. But logic is unapologetic in its assertion. There is nothing morally wrong with taking care of yourself, especially if you do it with honesty and respect. In essence, logic's argument is not about defending selfishness as a virtue, it is about defending self-respect as a necessity. It reminds us that we cannot pour from an empty cup, and that honoring ourselves is the first step toward any truly ethical life. 5. When selfishness becomes harmful, a shared concern. While heart and logic often approach selfishness from different angles, there is one place where they find common ground: the recognition that selfishness can cross a line and become harmful. This shared concern is crucial because it reminds us that selfishness, like any human behavior, exists on a spectrum ranging from healthy self-care to destructive self-centeredness. Understanding harmful selfishness. Harmful selfishness occurs when the pursuit of one's own interests causes significant and unjust damage to others, physically, emotionally, or socially. This is not merely about occasional prioritizing of personal needs, but a pattern of behavior that disregards others' well-being systematically, exploits relationships for personal gain, refuses to acknowledge or take responsibility for the consequences of one's actions, and creates imbalance in social, familial, or professional dynamics. Both heart and logic agree that this kind of selfishness is ethically problematic. It breaks the social contract that binds communities together and erodes trust that is essential for cooperation and emotional safety. Signs and consequences. Some key signs that selfishness has become harmful include repeated breaches of trust, for example, consistently breaking promises or using others' kindness without reciprocation. Emotional manipulation or neglect, using guilt, threats, or indifference to get one's way, while dismissing others' feelings. Ignoring boundaries, overstepping others' limits despite clear communication, which can cause emotional harm or resentment. Isolation and social fallout, when selfish behavior alienates friends, family, or colleagues, leading to loneliness or conflict. The consequences of harmful selfishness are wide-ranging. At an individual level, it can cause social rejection, damaged reputations, and loss of meaningful relationships. At a collective level, it undermines community cohesion, workplace productivity, and social trust. The moral responsibility to reflect and adjust. Both heart and logic emphasize the importance of self-awareness and moral reflection to prevent selfishness from tipping into harm. This involves listening to feedback, recognizing when others express hurt, frustration, or disappointment as signals to reassess one's behavior. Weighing outcomes, considering not just immediate personal gain but the long-term impact on relationships and social networks. Balancing needs, striving to meet one's own needs without systematically sacrificing others. Seeking repair, apologizing and making amends when selfish actions have caused harm. This shared responsibility helps to keep selfishness in check, ensuring it remains a tool for self-care rather than a weapon of disregard. The role of compassionate boundaries. Interestingly, the concern about harmful selfishness also extends to the other side of the coin, those who suppress their own needs excessively to avoid being selfish. Chronic self-sacrifice can lead to burnout, resentment, and eventual breakdown of relationships. Both heart and logic recognize that healthy selfishness is necessary to prevent harm to oneself. The challenge is to cultivate compassionate boundaries, ways of honoring personal needs while minimizing harm to others. This requires ongoing dialogue, flexibility, and mutual respect. A nuanced view of moral judgment. Ultimately, heart and logic caution against black and white moral judgments about selfishness. They acknowledge that context matters deeply. What is selfish in one situation may be survival in another. Cultural and personal histories shape how selfishness is perceived and enacted. Ethical living requires balancing self-interest with care for others, a dynamic process rather than a fixed rule. The shared concern about harmful selfishness thus becomes a call for mindfulness, to act with intention, to recognize impact, and to continuously strive for a balance that honors both self and community. 6. Is there such a thing as moral selfishness? The concept of moral selfishness might sound like an oxymoron at first. How can something considered selfish, often associated with greed or disregard for others, be moral? Yet, both heart and logic suggest that selfishness can indeed be ethical, even necessary, when aligned with deeper values of integrity, responsibility, and fairness. Defining moral selfishness. Moral selfishness refers to acting in one's own best interest in ways that are consistent with ethical principles, not at the expense of others, but in harmony with them. It's the recognition that prioritizing your own well-being is not inherently wrong. Self-care and personal boundaries are essential to sustain healthy relationships and communities. And sometimes, pursuing personal growth or happiness positively influences those around you. This form of selfishness is rooted in honesty, respect, and empathy. It involves clear communication about one's needs while considering the impact on others. Philosophical foundations. Several philosophical traditions support the idea of moral selfishness. Ayn Rand's objectivism famously champions rational self-interest as a moral imperative, arguing that living authentically and pursuing personal happiness is the foundation of a good life. Utilitarianism can support moral selfishness when personal fulfillment leads to greater overall happiness, either directly or indirectly. A virtue ethics emphasizes the development of character traits like self-respect, courage, and temperance, which require prioritizing one's own moral and psychological health. These frameworks highlight that selfishness, when thoughtful and principled, can be a moral stance rather than a vice. Examples of moral selfishness. In everyday life, moral selfishness might look like saying no to unhealthy demands in order to preserve your mental health, choosing a career path that aligns with your passions, even if it disappoints others' expectations, ending toxic relationships that drain your energy and undermine your values, allocating time for rest and personal growth, recognizing that you cannot give your best to others if you're depleted. In each case, the individual is not simply taking from others. Rather, they are honoring their own dignity and potential, which ultimately benefits their community by fostering healthier, more authentic interactions. Moral selfishness and social responsibility. Importantly, moral selfishness does not mean acting without regard for others. Instead, it involves a delicate balance, taking care of oneself while maintaining social responsibility. This balance requires awareness of impact, understanding how your choices affect those around you, communication, expressing needs honestly and listening to others' perspectives, a reciprocity, being willing to give and receive support as part of ongoing relationships. Moral selfishness invites us to be active agents in our lives, not passive responders to external demands or internal guilt. Challenges and misconceptions. Despite its validity, moral selfishness is often misunderstood or resisted. It can be mistaken for selfishness in the negative sense, greed, entitlement, or indifference. Cultural norms frequently promote self-sacrifice as the highest moral ideal, making self-prioritization feel taboo. People may struggle with internalized guilt or fear of social rejection when acting in their own interest. Overcoming these challenges requires reframing selfishness as a spectrum, where moral selfishness is a responsible, compassionate practice rather than an indulgent or harmful one. The transformative potential. When embraced wisely, moral selfishness can be transformative. It fosters self-respect and resilience, enabling people to contribute more meaningfully to their communities. It encourages authenticity, reducing resentment and conflict born from hidden needs or unmet boundaries. It nurtures emotional health, which in turn supports empathy and generosity. Ultimately, moral selfishness is not just about the self. It's about creating a sustainable way of living that honors both individual and collective flourishing. 7. The resolution, a middle way. After exploring the emotional and rational dimensions of selfishness, as well as its potential harms and virtues, heart and logic converge on a crucial insight. The healthiest path is rarely found in extremes, but in a balanced middle way. This middle way respects both the needs of the self and the well-being of others, acknowledging the complexity and nuance inherent in human relationships. Why extremes fail? Extremes on either end of the selfishness spectrum carry risks. Excessive self-sacrifice leads to burnout, resentment, and loss of identity. When one constantly puts others first without regard for personal limits, they risk emotional exhaustion and compromised mental health. Unrestrained selfishness breeds alienation, mistrust, and social breakdown. Prioritizing oneself without empathy or boundaries fractures relationships and erodes community. Heart and logic agree that neither ignoring your own needs nor disregarding others can sustain healthy living or ethical integrity. The middle way as dynamic balance. The middle way is not a fixed point, but a dynamic balancing act that shifts according to context, relationships, and personal growth. It involves self-awareness, continuously checking in with your own feelings, needs, and limits. Empathy, remaining attuned to the emotional states and boundaries of others. Communication, engaging in honest and respectful dialogue about needs, expectations, and compromises. Flexibility, being willing to adjust boundaries and priorities as situations evolve. This fluid approach allows for mutual respect and cooperation rather than rigid rules or guilt-laden obligations. Practical strategies for the middle way. Living this balanced path involves practical tools such as setting clear boundaries while explaining the reasoning to others to foster understanding rather than conflict. Practicing assertive communication that honors both your truth and the feelings of others. Reflecting on motivations regularly. Are your actions motivated by fear, guilt, or genuine care? Allowing for reciprocity, both giving and receiving help, support, and attention. Accepting imperfection, acknowledging that sometimes selfishness or selflessness may tip too far, and that learning is part of the process. The middle way in moral philosophy. This resolution echoes many philosophical traditions. Aristotelian virtue ethics emphasizes moderation as a key virtue, the golden mean between excess and deficiency. Buddhism's middle path avoids extremes of self-indulgence and self-denial, focusing on mindful balance. A contemporary ethical frameworks stress relational ethics, where morality is negotiated and contextual rather than absolute. The middle way recognizes the interdependence of self and others, promoting a worldview where personal flourishing and social harmony coexist. Benefits of embracing the middle way. Choosing this balanced approach offers several benefits. Sustainable relationships, grounded in mutual respect and understanding rather than obligation or neglect. Psychological well-being, supporting both self-care and meaningful connection. Ethical integrity, allowing for honest choices that align with values without guilt or selfish disregard. Adaptability, enabling one to navigate complex social situations with wisdom and compassion. Conclusion, beyond selfishness and selflessness. The middle way reframes the conversation from a binary of selfish versus selfless to a nuanced interplay of self-care and social care. It encourages embracing moral complexity, understanding that every situation demands discernment, compassion, and thoughtful negotiation between heart and logic. In the end, the question is not, is being selfish wrong, but rather, how can we honor ourselves while honoring others in a way that enriches all our lives? By finding this middle way, we move beyond simplistic judgments and toward a richer, more humane ethics, one that embraces the full spectrum of human experience. The ethics of the self in a shared world. Selfishness, like any human impulse, is morally fluid. It can heal or harm, liberate or isolate, depending on how it is wielded. To ask whether selfishness is wrong is to ask a deeper question. How do we balance love for the self with responsibility to others? The conversation between heart and logic reminds us that moral clarity rarely comes from extremes. It emerges from tension and from the courage to listen to both voices inside us. Remember, finding harmony between your heart and your logic is the key to understanding when being selfish serves your well-being and when it's time to lean into empathy. Thank you for watching Egopedia, where ego meets awareness. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay true.